أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, our dear brothers and sisters. Thank you for joining us tonight. The Book of the World, Journeying with the Quran in 30 Nights. I welcome with me tonight my dear brother Dr. Hassan Lamy. First and foremost, I would like to once again congratulate you on the birth anniversary of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and I would also like to extend my heartfelt congratulations and wishes to all our great mothers across the world in the East and the West in commemoration of Mother's Day. And subhanallah, brother Hassan, it falls on the same night as our reflection on Surat Maryam alayhi salam. And I would like to share with you a poetic reflection that I came up with from my deep contemplation on the notion of motherhood. I say, Al-Ummu Bahrun Tajri bihi sufunu. The example of the mother in the East and the West is like a sea or an ocean through which the boats sail, the boats of humanity. Al-Ummu Bahrun Tajri bihi sufunu min ajli ajyalin tarqa biha al-umamu. For the sake of generations to come that will raise the ranks of nations morally and spiritually. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel Enlightened Thought. You can also follow us on Facebook, sydney.org.au. The roadmap for tonight's session will go as follows. Dr. Hassan Lamy will provide us with a contextual scaffolding in his geometric and optical lenses of Surat Maryam alayhi salam and Surat Taha, and I will present on Maryam alayhi salam, a lady for the world, as well as Musa alayhi salam in the context of Surat Taha, from victimhood to self-transformation. Without further ado, let us listen to the beautiful recitation of Sheikh Mohammed al-Dihnawi.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. كافها يا عين صاد ذكر رحمة ربك عبده زكريا إذ نادى ربه نداء خفيا قال رب إني وهن العظم مني واشتعل الرأس شيبا ولم أكن بدعائك رب شقيا وإني خفت الموالي من ورائي وكانت امرأتي عاقرا فهب لي من لدنك وليا يرثني ويرث من آل يعقوب واجعله رب رضيا يا زكريا إنا نبشرك بغلام اسمه يحيى لم نجعل له من قبل سميا قال رب أنى يكون لي غلام وكانت امرأتي عاقرا وقد بلغت من الكبر عتيا قال كذلك قال ربك هو علي هين وقد خلقتك من قبل ولم تك شيئا.
Present half of my tahzir. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. Thank you, Akh Mohammed, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Muhammad Sadiq, for your continuous work on the media side. And I would like as well to congratulate all the moms around the world and all the women around the world for the great work, for great sacrifice that they do for the community to progress to the next level and next stage. And subhanAllah, as Muhammad mentioned, Surat Maryam will be discussed tonight in the context of Mother's Day, in the context of the birthday of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, and in the context of the victory of War of Badr in the Islamic history. Surat Maryam is Surah number 19, and it has 98 verses. this chapter, it's a very soft and tender and emotional and very flowery in its presentation, and very beautiful in its moral virtues, presented in different aspects. And what is interesting, in the entire Quran, only one female is mentioned by name. We have different female characters in Quran, but only one of the females was chosen from the divine wisdom to be mentioned by name, and that's Maryam Salamullah alayha. And this chapter, as we will go through it, 5 other major prophets are mentioned, but the name Maryam is chosen for this chapter. And what is interesting, Maryam, who is devout, revolutionary, moral, the lady in the history of mankind, for this chapter also represents that softness of womanhood, not from a position of weakness, but rather from the position of moral virtues exhibited by women in life and in history. So you will see this tender and softness, that you face the world with flowers, not with swords, not with weapons. And I think beautifully this notion is emphasized by the choice of the name of the chapter, as well as by the characters mentioned in this chapter. So this chapter, if we have to summarize the major theme in it, the major theme is the relationship between human being and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through one major avenue, through one major way, and that is as-salah. As-salah, as you know, doesn't mean prayer, the Muslim prayer. As-salah, as opposite to the يعني صلى وتولى, meaning to face your compass towards God in any ways possible. One of the ways is prayer. It's called as-salah. So in this chapter you will see different notion of as-salah mentioned in multiple words that I will come at the end of the summary of this chapter. We will see different aspects of the notion of salah. So this chapter is about this beautiful, spiritual, deep, insightful du'as, supplications between a pure heart, between a broken heart, between a heart which has experienced suffering and pains on the path of God, making and supplicating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a wish, for a dua to be granted. And we will see how this chapter focuses on this notion. So if Surat Al Kahf was about the notion of hamd and tasbih and takbir, and 2 pathways, the pathway of the iman wa amal al-salih, and the pathway of al-nisyan and al-dunya, this surah is about not hamd per se, but about the love relationship with God subhanahu wa ta'ala. And 2 groups will emerge. The group who are ahlus salah, meaning they always oriented their compass towards God, and those who are ahlul hawa, who basically take the God as their selfishness, as their selfhood, as their desires and whims. So in this chapter we will see one name of God being magnified, emphasized. So the name is Maryam. The notion of a lady, womanhood is mentioned. What is surprising, the name of God, the attribute of God which is magnified in this surah 16 times is Ar-Rahman. And as we have in the tradition, the prophetic tradition, or this hadith al-Qudsi, that God says that my name is Ar-Rahman, and I name the womb of the woman from my name, to indicate this level of mercy, this level of compassion, this level of sacrifice that a woman, a mom, goes through during her life. And you can see this relationship. Ar-Rahman is the attribute that is magnified, emphasized and highlighted in this chapter, as if a woman is manifestation of this attribute of God on earth. So if you want to see the manifestation of Ar-Rahman on earth, it is to look at your mom's face. It is to look at this pious woman in the history, and you will see Ar-Rahman. So Ar-Rahman, as I said, is the major name. So 3 attributes, names of God is mentioned: Allah, Ar-Rab, but Ar-Rahman is the highest in terms of its repetition in Quran. So this chapter can be divided into multiple parts depending on the character mentioned. So as we said, it is about the relation between human and God and the supplication that they made, which was granted. So there are 6 characters mentioned: Zakaria, Maryam, Ibrahim, Musa, Ismail, Idris. And then at the end you have a conclusion. So Zakaria, when we look at the vocabulary of the verses about Zakaria, Nada, he's calling upon God. Da'a, he's supplicating. And his dua, his supplication, فَهَبْ لِي مِن لَدُنْكَ وَلِيًّا. And then he goes and tells his people, سَبِّحُوا. So, and obviously he doesn't want his son, the dua is not a selfish dua. He wants a son who carries this message for the future generation. And that's why he calls him Yahya, a name which was not before, not in terms of a title. Yahya who gives hayat to the society through the missionary act that he will complement. What was the result? The result is we will give you a ghulam ismuhu Yahya. What's the result? You will have a son who will carry this message, has the notion of Hanan. Again, this Ar-Rahman, this softness, this gentleness is there. Or Lam yakun jabbaran asiya. Again, indicating this kindness, gentleness, softness. So that's
and lack of struggle or concern for reaching power.
Exactly. And sacrificing. Second person, who is basically the central character in this chapter, is Maryam salamullah alayha. إذ انتبذت من أهلها مكان الشرقية, that you mentioned yesterday. Sometimes we need this retreat. Sometimes we need to remove ourselves, because sometimes the best response to an injustice, to a struggle, is to say, I'm not part of it. فاتخذت من دونهم حجابا. So indicating again, she retreated. She did not approve of that. She needed some time for her self-purification and self-growth. What was the result? He was given a son again to carry this mission, to bring the nation which was so rigid and solid to a nation of softness and gentleness and kindness. غُلَامًا زَكِيًّا, Abdullah, Nabiyan. I want to focus on one of the characters of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and that's Mubarakan. وَجَعَلِنِي مُبَارَكًا أَيْنَمَا كُنْتَ. That I'm a blessing. Mubarak is from Barakah. Like in Arabic, a pond is called Birka. Why? Because it indicates a blessing which stays there, which is there for a long time. Mubarak is a blessing which is like a birka, which stays in a place for a long time.
Long lasting. Long
lasting, exactly. Imagine a person who, whether is absent or present, is a blessing for people. As the hadith of Ali alayhi salam says, that this type of people, when they are absent, people yearn, their heart melt to see them. And when they are present, people just enjoy that presence, and they just want to be with them in that presence. And Isa alayhi salam represents that, Mubarakan. And inshallah we can implement that. Be a type of person who is Mubarak, in a way that if we went away, people make dua that we may come back, so they can enjoy this presence. And when we come, they can again enjoy that presence, not say that inshallah Allah yakhallasna minna. وأوصاني بالصلاة والزكاة وبرا بوالدتي ولم يجعلني جبارا شقيا. Again, this notion that we're not jabbar, we're not shaqi, we're not asi. The third person, Ibrahim, we have talked about him, and every few pages Ibrahim comes in Quran because he's the perfect role model. Ibrahim. Again, I want to focus a bit on Ibrahim. Ibrahim has a discussion with his father, and I said this chapter picks on the parts of the stories where it is related to the notion of dua, supplication, gentleness, kindness, ar-rahmah, mercy, compassion. He tells his dad, whether it's biological dad, whether it's instructor, uncle, whatever, but he has that fatherly role, that come and join the camp of Tawheed. The dad says, لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِ لَأَرْجُمَنَّكَ. If you don't stop this type of nonsense, I will stone you. And stoning mentioned 3 times, I think, in Quran, and whenever it's mentioned by the enemies of the prophets towards the prophet. Prophets never exercise such action. Look at the response of Ibrahim to indicate, I would call this Maryamness characteristic, this woman hood, this mercy, this rahmah. قال السلام عليك. He wants to stone him. He wants to turn him away. He wants to say that go away, I'm going to exile you. He says that peace be upon you. سأستغفر لك ربي. I will ask for forgiveness from God for you. Look at Ibrahim in the exercising the notion of rahmah, ar-Rahman. So please read the verses in each section for each prophet. So what's the result of Ibrahim having this action? وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُم مِّن رَحْمَتِنَا وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُم لِسَانَ صِدْقٍ عَلِيًّا. That we put a good remembrance for them in the coming generations. The 4th person is Musa alayhi salam, mentioned in this chapter in a sequential manner. إِنَّهُ كَانَ مُخْلِصًا وَنَادَيْنَاهُ مِنْ جَانِبِ الطُّورِ الْأَيْمَنِ. That's when he received his revelation. What was the result of this dua, this supplication that Musa had? وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ مِنْ رَحْمَتِنَا أَخَاهُ هَارُونَ نَبِيًّا. That we made it easy for him by gifting him his brother Harun as a messenger to help him in this mission. The 5th person is Ismail, because there is lack of time, I'll move on. And the 6th person is Idris. Again, you can see this chapter focusing on the notion of dua, and the nights of dua are coming. How, if we purify our heart, we make ourselves sincere, and we work hard for it, and we make a dua which is godly in nature, which is not self-centered, because all of these people went outside themselves towards God, it will be granted. And that's the power of dua. And finally, I want to finish with the vocabularies of salah in this chapter. The word salah, as we said, is facing towards God. There are 16 words in relation to as-salah. Number 1, buka. This pure tears, because when the heart melts, then the tears come out. As the verse here, it says, إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُ الرَّحْمَنِ خَرُّ سُجَّدًا وَبُكِيًّا. These tears. الذِّكْر, remembrance. التقرب, closeness and proximity. إخلاص, purity. عبادة, worshipping. تسبيح, glorification. توبة, to return. استغفار, to ask for forgiveness. تزكية, purification. اعتزال, the idea of retreat for personal growth. Mihrab is the place where you are fighting your egoistic side. Sajda, the act of prostration to show humbleness and humility. Dua, supplication, meaning extending your hand, saying that I'm doing my work, but at the end of the day the results are in the hands of God. And nida, this sincere call for help. Wa an najwa. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Akh Mohammed, if you would like to add anything in regards to this.
Thank you, Brother Hassan Lamy, for your very engaging commentary on this beautiful ayah in the Quran. Let us move to Sheikh Mohammed Al-Dihnawi for the following recitation of the Quran, and then we'll finish off our first part for tonight, inshallah.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. فأجاءها المخاض إلى جذع النخلة قالت يا ليتني مت قبل هذا وكنت نسيا منسيا فناداها من تحتها ألا تحزني قد جعل ربك تحتك سريا وهزي إليك بجذع النخلة تساقط عليك رطبا جنيا فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما فلن أكلم اليوم إنسيا.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome back. As Brother Hassan beautifully introduced the geometric scaffolding of Surah Maryam alayhi salam, let me begin with why I chose the title Maryam, a lady for our world. When we look into the feminist scholarship on scripture in the past few decades, we notice that a greater awareness of unexamined female founding figures across the monotheistic traditions is becoming more salient and more important for our understanding of the trajectory and system of values of the monotheistic traditions across world history. And this is an important shift away from androcentric, that is masculine centric perspective on scriptures, which often limit the exemplary light and exemplary presentation of these monotheistic traditions to the male figures. I'll give you an example, and perhaps we can explore this in future occasions. We see Maryam alayhi salam. She is an example beyond her place and time for what she represents in terms of her silent yet effective resistance against the patriarchal hierarchy and hegemony of her society, in terms of her innocence, in terms of her self-affirmation, in terms of her selfless dedication to serving the temple, in terms of her motherhood role. We see these themes being highlighted in the Quran to remind us that Maryam alayhi salam is a phenomenon. She is not a lady who just existed in history. She is the Maryam of every day and age, struggling to uphold all these values. That's why we see, for example, in the biblical tradition, there is a revisitation of what they call Marianic studies. So not just Mary, the mother of Jesus, but also Mary Magdalene. We see Mary of Bethany. We see Miriam, the sister of Musa alayhi salam. As you can see, we are becoming more interested in exploring how these female founding and exemplary figures manifested the message of Islam through their own experience in that context. An important way to discover the Quranic viewpoint on particular values is to study what we call the dramatizations of the Quran. When people are portrayed in the Quran, for example, when we see them praying, talking, expressing body language, acting, defending, resisting, we may ask what particular elements of their character is highlighted. We see some of the most sympathetic and gripping portraits in the Quran are of women. And here I surveyed and I found 5 particular exemplary examples. Number one, the Queen of Saba, the exemplary democratic leader, who was an example of a woman who responds successfully to dialogue in the Quran with Sulaiman, as opposed to the Pharaoh, who is a male figure who fails in the dialogue with Musa and Harun. That's number one. So dialogue here, and the success of dialogue comes from a woman and not from a man. Number two, the mother of Musa alayhi salam, about to surrender her son to the will of God. Number three, the wife of the Pharaoh, seeking God's protection from the oppression of her husband. Number four, Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Maryam, dedicating her unborn baby to the service of God. And number five, the story of Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. While men in the Quran are portrayed on a range from being utterly despicable to noble prophets, all of the dramatizations of women in the Quran are positive, which I think is very eye-opening and warrants our research and our reflection. When I say positive, I am not referring to a mere statement of fact that Abu Lahab's wife will suffer damnation. I am not referring to the fact that Noah's and Lot's spouses rebelled. For we are not shown the specific elements of these figures' characters in the story of the Quran. In all cases, the exemplary women are shown in a positive light, except for one. Even this exception repents towards the end of her drama, and that is in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, Zulaykha. My dear brothers and sisters, when we look at the word Maryam, obviously there are various meanings and interpretations for the word Maryam and the name Maryam. But let me introduce to you something that I found very eye-opening. Who names these exemplary figures in the Quran? Who exercised the act of naming in the first place? Adam alayhi salam is associated with this first mission of naming and knowing names and saying the names and teaching the names. وعلم آدم الأسماء قال يا آدم أنبئهم بأسمائهم. But when it comes to the story of Maryam alayhi salam, we see the naming happening from a mother, from a female figure, and not a father. Where is Maryam's father? Her father is not put at the center of deciding what the name of the newly born baby will be, who will serve the temple. He doesn't have any say in the naming process. As if this story is teaching us that the first step of breaking down the patriarchy in our society is to bring forth the very naming from the mother and not from the father. Maryam alayhi salam is a common adjective connotating blessing. And that's why we see Surat Maryam, for example, in the comparative theological context corresponding to Luke's Gospel, chapter 1 in the Bible. And I encourage this cross-scripture study and research. Maryam alayhi salam, according to other scholars, is also mentioned in the context of someone who remains in a particular place, in a particular position. So again, being steadfast. Maryam Rama Yarimu, not from Rama Yarumu, according to some scholars, which means someone who actually stays and remains dedicated and steadfast in a particular place that represents a value. My dear brothers and sisters, as Brother Hassan mentioned, Ar-Rahman, which is the limitless mercy of Allah, which extends not just to the believers, but even to those who do not join the camp of the believers was mentioned 16 times. Now, how do we link this to Maryam being the lady for the world? I believe we can link it to an incident that took place under the most difficult times in the early stages of Islam's infancy. Ja'far bin Abi Talib and his people in Abyssinia, the 83 delegation that migrated, the first Muslims that migrated to Abyssinia, and we mentioned Al-Najashi. I'll finish off with this. Maryam alayhi salam suffered. Ja'far bin Abi Talib was the Maryam with his people of their time in the presence of the Christian king who heard the chapter of Maryam. If you remember yesterday, and this is me trying to connect the dots, yesterday we spoke about how Ashab Al Kahaf represented the bridge between the North Africans and the French. In the early Islamic experience, Maryam alayhi salam represents the bridge between the suffering Muslims and the just Christians, beyond the oppression of the Quraysh. My dear brothers and sisters, when Ja'far bin Abi Talib recited a portion of Surah Maryam from verse 17 to 26, the Najashi draws a line in the sand with his stick and says, the difference between you and me is the width of this line. Isn't this an example of how Maryam alayhi salam melts all these superficial differences between Christianity of Islam and Islam that resulted from the prejudices of history to bring together the two like never before in a moment of humane dedication to social justice? I'll finish off on this point. Let us go for a 5-minute break and then we'll return for our second part tonight, inshallah.
Ahsant.
You came to me in that hour of need, when I was so lost, so lonely. You came to me, took my breath away, showed me the right way, the way to lead. You filled my heart with love, showed me the light above. Now all I want is to be with you. You are my one true love, taught me to never judge. Now all I want is to be with you. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Mustafa ala Habibika Nabika Mustafa. You came to me in a time of despair. I called on you, you were there. Without you, what would my life mean? To not know the unseen, the worlds between. For you I'd sacrifice, for you I'd give my life, anything, just to be with you. I feel so lost at times by all the hurt and lies. Now all I want is to be with you. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Mustafa ala Habibika Nabika Mustafa. Showed me right from wrong, told me to be strong. Need you more than ever, Ya Rasulullah. You came to me in that hour of need. Need you more than ever, Ya Rasulallah. You filled my heart with love, showed me the light above. Now all I want is to be with you. You are my one true love, taught me to never judge. Now all I want is to be with you. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Mustafa ala Habibika Nabika Mustafa. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Mustafa ala Habibika Nabika Mustafa. For you I'd sacrifice, for you I'd give my life, anything, just to be with you.
Assalamu alaikum again, dear brothers and sisters. Thank you, Akh Mohammed, for those beautiful points that you mentioned about Sayyidah Maryam Salamullah alayha. We may take her as a role model, and as we have always mentioned, there is no single period of time and there is no single human being in the history without a role model, and who are better than such personalities in history to be our role models. Let us move to Surah Taha, and Sheikh will be reciting the first few verses and I'll be providing the scaffolding.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Taha ما أنزلنا عليك القرآن لتشقى إلا تذكرة لمن يخشى تنزيلا ممن خلق الأرض والسماوات العلى الرحمن على العرش استوى له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وما بينهما وما تحت الثرى وإن تجهر بالقول فإنه يعلم السر وأخفى الله لا إله إلا هو له الأسماء الحسنى.
Assalamu alaikum again. As you know, we are covering the Juz' number 17 of Juz' 16 of Quran, and we covered Surah Maryam. Now we're going to be covering Surah Taha. So Surah Taha is Surah number 20, which forms part of Juz' 16 and starts with Taha. There are lots of interpretations what Taha means. The major one is there are huruf al-muqatta'a, there are these separated letters. Let me provide you with a possible principle in Quran mentioned by Allama Tabatabai in his blessed book Al-Mizan. He says that if we connect these separated letters, for example Taha in Surah Taha or Surah Maryam Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad, he says that these letters indicate the themes in each chapter, and each chapter which has similarities or similar letters, it means there are similar themes being explored in these chapters. So if we apply this notion mentioned by Allama Tabatabai, Taha, the Ta is similar to three other chapters in Quran. Nahl, Ta, Sin, so it has the letter Ta, and Shu'ara and Qasas, Ta, Sin, Mim. So when we look at all these 4 chapters, we see one major theme, and that's the life of Musa alayhi salam. Ha, Taha. Ha is mentioned in another chapter, and that was Maryam. Kaf, Ha. So, and if we look at both of them, is the one of the theme is the salah, the ibadah, the worshipping, the inclination and the moral compass towards God through the avenue of dua, worshipping, and the remembrance of God. So, putting these 2 together, so this chapter, the major themes are the story of Musa alayhi salam through the lens of dua, through the lens of worshipping, through the lens of turning to God through these heartfelt conversations. This surah, they say it is Mecca, possibly year 4 and year 5 of the initiation of the Islamic mission. We can divide the surah in 5 parts. The first 8 verses is the introduction, in which God addresses the Prophet in order to provide some moral support and how he should treat the fact that some may reject the notion of Islam, your message, and how you should be careful you don't invest too much emotions because at the end of the day the guidance is in the hands of God. So that's the first part. The second part, which composes the major section of this chapter, about 90 verses, is the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam from the time he took his mission from the mountain of Tur to the time that Bani Israel were saved. And then you have the golden calf, the Samiri, the story of Samiri, and then again it takes a turn back to the beginning of the life of Musa alayhi salam. That's the style of storytelling in Quran, which is very different to normal human style of storytelling, which we have usually starts from a beginning to end with a few flashbacks in between. But Quran may start from the end, goes to the beginning, comes back again to the middle. The third part is about 16 verses from 99 to 114. So the story of Musa is about the past, because the discussion is with the Prophet of the past. Now goes to the future, which is the hereafter, and the result of our actions and how that will be embodied in the hereafter. Then again takes a flashback to the initial history of mankind, the story of Adam alayhi salam, about 12 verses. In general, let me mention again another principle in Quran when you are reading Quran. In Quran, 5 major themes are constantly discussed. The story of the past, the story of the present, which is Prophet and his companions, the story of the future, which is hereafter, natural phenomenon, and the issue of tashri', the jurisprudential and religious teachings. So 5 major themes. Now it comes to the story of Adam alayhi salam, and then at the end, 9 verses again comes back to the Prophet and provides advices and recommendations on how to exercise moral virtues such as patience, such as salah, such as tasbih, and also how to deal with the deviations in his tribe and amongst his followers. So that's in a nutshell Surah Taha. It's again one of the most beautiful surah in Quran. It has this connection with Surah Maryam in its softness and in its beauty. To you, Mohammed, if you have any points to add.
Thank you, Brother Hassan, for your very succinct yet insightful understanding and scaffolding. Inshallah, we can elaborate more on Surah Taha in my part. Let us now listen to the final recitation of the Quran for tonight's session.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وهل أتاك حديث موسى إذ رأى نارا فقال لأهلهم كثوا إني آنست نارا لعلي آتيكم منها بقبس أو أجد على النار هدى فلما أتاها نودي يا موسى إني أنا ربك فاخلع عليك إنك بالواد المقدس طوى وأنا اخترتك فاستمع لما يوحى إنني أنا الله لا إله إلا أنا فاعبدني وأقم الصلاة لذكري إن الساعة آتية أكاد أخفيها لتجزى كل نفس بما تسعى فلا يصدنك عنها من لا يؤمن بها واتبع هواه فتردى وما تلك بيمينك يا موسى قال هي عصاي أتوكأ عليها وأهش بها على غنمي ولي فيها مآرب أخرى.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, dear brothers and sisters. طه ما أنزلنا عليك القرآن لتشقى. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, with his companions and with the unsung heroes of the Arab society, they were under so much stress and distress. We know that, for example, Surat Al Kahaf was revealed according to some narrations in order to console the Prophet as well, because the message of Islam was being scorned. Now the Quraysh take it further to exercise character assassination and to exercise soft violence against the Muslims, to the point that they say to them, لَقَدْ شَقَاكُمُ الْقُرْآنِ, the Quran has caused you so much misery. What is this Iman all about? Look at your situation. You are suffering. Is this the end of your religion? And this is a question that we need to raise and face on a daily basis. Is religion a means to an end or an end in itself? Is religion something that we need to worship, or do we gain guidance for religion in order to worship Allah, who is above all religions? My dear brothers and sisters, the context of طه ما أنزلنا عليك القرآن لتشقى is a beautiful surah that speaks about the moral efforts and the moral failures we go through in life. I would contextualize this surah as a shift from victimhood to self-transformation. In other words, the Quran says you need to understand that the purpose of this message is not misery and suffering. But this does not entail that the purpose is the popular definition of happiness, that is, you be happy all the time and you experience joy all the time. But rather, from within the struggle of your mission, of your life, you will always find the true happiness after you realize how your life and your self-transformation is building up into a new character. This is why you see the meaning of this definition of happiness in the Quran is actually witnessed in the self-transformation process of a number of companions who, if you look at their lives in pre-Islamic Arabia and you compare it to how they appeared after the character self-transformation with Islam, it's a 180-degree turning point. Look at Umar ibn al-Khattab, for example. He was this harsh, vicious man. I guess it was Surah Taha that affected him aesthetically. And he was transformed. He became one of the just rulers in history. Now, whether we disagree with him on particular points, He is, at the end of the day, a human being. But from a civilizational point of view, as Dr. Shariati says, we cannot but acknowledge that he had a degree of justice in his leadership. Look at Umar before and Umar after. Look at Abu Dharr al-Ghifari before and after, who became one of the great advocates of social justice. Nevertheless, my dear brothers and sisters, we can look at a practical case study in Surah Taha, and that is Musa alayhi salam. Before I delve into this case study, I want to pose the following question. You may be a victim in life of one of the worst crimes, of one of the worst disappointments, but you can also refuse to see yourself as a victim. We can look back or we can look forward. If we look back, we will ask, why did this happen? And it's a natural question. But this natural question will lead to a natural response: revenge, resentment, negative self-talk. The second question, which is the prospective orientation, the looking forward: what shall I do next? Let's look at the first practical example, Musa alayhi salam. Musa was a social outcast. He was expelled due to the accident killing of the Coptic. He could have defined himself as an innocent criminal. He could have remained in this state of victimhood and engaged in all sorts of blame. But Musa alayhi salam receives the revelation, which is included in Surah Taha: اخلعنا عليك إنك في الوادي المقدس طوى. Take off your shoes. In other words, take off this history of guilt, of blame, of worry, of sadness. You have become a messenger of God, and you will traverse from that point in history to a noble mission that will save humanity. اخلعنا عليك إنك في الوادي المقدس طوى. You are in the divine valley of Tuwa. I call this process a metamorphosis of character. So the change is not only a superficial change, it's a change in the very structure of your character. And so Musa is transformed from being the innocent killer to a messenger who will stand before the most vicious ruler in his time, Pharaoh, and his people. More than that, Allah beautifully symbolizes this transformation by saying to Musa, even your stick will now take on a new function in that mission. This stick will face all the media plots of the Pharaoh with the power that he gained from you being a shepherd, from you expressing the mercy towards your flock, from you being that responsible character before your prophethood. It will transform that society, and you will not only save them from the oppression of the Pharaoh, but you will walk them through the desert. You will guide them to another society, to another state of being.
What is interesting, this notion of metamorphosis happens to all the characters in this story. Allah. Because the next character, which I think not much light is shed on them, is the Sahirin.
Hassan.
Because Sahirin is not simply magicians,
no.
Rather they represent the intellectuals and the educated class of that time, that they changed and went through this metamorphosis not by a rational argumentation, rather by referring to their conscience, which is a different type of proof for faith. And I think that's the beauty of faith. Faith is not simply a rational thing. Rather, it's beyond that, this consciousness. And they did not care whether they were killed or they were their legs and hands were cut. They said that all you do is govern this life. You cannot govern the hereafter. And you can see this metamorphosis that from a luxurious life to saying that who cares about this life?
Absolutely, Hassan. And that's what you call the proof of morality, the moral compass. Subhanallah, they did not succumb to the physical persecution, but were rather free in their moral, which is beyond any form of domination that comes from the outside. Ahsan. And so, if this is the case of Musa, my dear brothers and sisters, doesn't this also remind you of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa? Again, what the Quran is teaching us in Surah Taha is that you cannot be stuck in your past. Every single person has injuries. Every single person in life has wounds.
Exactly.
But you cannot be stuck there because the world is in need of you.
Exactly.
You are not a number. You're an entire world in itself that can transform your society within the limits of your capacity and within the limits of your society. We're not advocating for an ideological totalitarian change here, but something that's significant to who you are and what you can contribute.
And that doesn't mean it's a overnight change, because even Musa still had those feelings, because I think it's in the verse 45, قال ربنا إننا نخاف. They still had that worry, which means that they were still in the process of going from victimhood to, as you said, being responsible human beings to a messenger. So it was still there. This emotional basically the states don't change overnight. They require a process in order to go from one level to another.
Absolutely, and as if the Quran here is alluding to something that Bertrand Russell, the prominent philosopher of the 20th century, once said, that we actually find long-lasting happiness in serving things beyond ourselves. Very important, as if the Quran is trying to teach us through Musa that if you couldn't at an individual level overcome this personal past history, then dedicate yourself beyond the individual self, so that you allow these wounds to heal. It's like when you have to expose the very wounds on your skin to the air after placing a band-aid. You have to expose it, otherwise it's not going to help for it to dry. Nevertheless, ثم جئت على قدر يا موسى. Each one of us can make their own destiny, and this is an existential philosophy. And Layal al-Qadr are coming, absolutely. Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power and determination. You can determine that. ثم جئت على قدر يا موسى. Obviously Qadr has a number of meanings, but one of them is fate. Now you need to embrace a new fate, O Musa. Khadija alayhi salam, who is another exemplary model, embraces Prophet Muhammad upon his first reception of revelation. She says to him, after covering him with a blanket, لا والله لا يخزيك الله إنك لتقري الضيف وتعين على نوائب الحق وتطعم المسكين. You, surely God will never delude you. You're a man who helped the debtors get out of debt. You're a man who fed the hungry. You spoke only the truth and always stood for justice. My dear brothers and sisters, I'll finish off with a contemporary case of the spirit of Musa in Surah Taha. And it comes from a lady who's still alive, who survived the horrific challenges of Auschwitz in the Nazi concentration camps. In May 1944, age 16, Edith Eger, who is a psychologist, she's 92 or 93 years old. What a lady. Look how long she lived by virtue of having this purpose beyond herself. With her mother, father and sister from Hungary were taken to Auschwitz, her parents were killed immediately. Doesn't this remind you of the story of most prophets? How they were detached? When she asked an inmate of the concentration camp when she would see her mother again, this part breaks my heart, especially on Mother's Day. The woman pointed to the smoke rising from a chimney in the distance and said to her, "She is burning there." Talk about her in the past tense. This lady, Iga, miraculously survived death, the death march that killed most of her companions after Auschwitz. When she was discovered by the American GIs, she had severe fever, lying beneath a pile of corpses with a broken back. Trauma was her identity, but it wasn't her fate. She says, the trauma I faced back then, I could not overcome until the age of 53. But at the age of 90, perhaps in 2007 when she published the book I will share with you and I recommend you to read it, she says, at the age of 90, I wrote my autobiography, the book titled The Choice, Embrace the Possible. She says suffering is universal, but victimhood is optional. She says there are two types of victim identity. One, victimization, which comes from the outside. We are all victims in one way or another. But there is a second type, which is victimhood, which comes from the inside, and that is where we can define and we can redefine. She is inspired and she empowers the people she treats by giving them her own strength. She is inspired by a Jewish tradition known as Tikkun Olam, meaning redemption of the past, the healing of a fractured world. For her, you can see these are the monotheistic traditions that we find across the scriptures. We find it in Taha, Ikhla'na alayk, innaka fil wadi al-muqaddas tuwa. In the Jewish scripture, Tikkun Olam. She says, and that is how I was able to come to this conclusion: to be passive is to let others decide for you, but to be aggressive is to decide for others. We need to be, she says, proactive and assertive in deciding for ourselves, and to trust that it is enough and you are enough. Finally, doesn't this remind you of something even beyond the monotheistic tradition, which intersects with the heart of the monotheistic tradition in the Japanese culture, known as kintsugi, the centuries old tradition of repairing broken pottery with gold. The Japanese people believe that anything broken should be repaired with gold, because these broken wounds are part of your journey to the future in serving humanity. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.